Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our webinar on the future of federal AI. We're going to discuss what it will really take to operationalize AI adoption across government and how to incorporate the appropriate levels of security, compliance, and trust. Even the government shutdown cannot stop us from discussing such an important topic. So my name is Renan. I lead strategy for Duality. I'll be today's moderator, and I am joined today by a stellar panel, which I will now introduce. Richard Spires has such an impressive list of accomplishments, I had trouble summarizing them succinctly, but a few highlights are that he has decades of leadership experience across technology firms and government, including the role of Chief Information Officer at both the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the IRS. He's authored 2 books and is currently an independent consultant to the public and private sectors. Next is Admiral Mike Rogers, who I am lucky enough to simply call Mike, served as the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and the director of the National Security Agency, among other senior roles in the U.S. national security and defense community. Today, he advises various companies, including, luckily, Duality. And finally is Dr. Kurt Roloff. Kurt is Duality's CTO and one of the company's co-founders. Kurt is a leader in the privacy technology community, founding the premier open source homomorphic encryption library called OpenFHE, leading the homomorphic encryption standards body, and serving as a principal investigator on multiple DARPA projects over the years. Our goal today is to have a conversation, and we're going to try and touch on 6 major themes: policy mandates and compliance, AI threats and defense, privacy technologies, infrastructure, trust, and what might be coming in the future. Please use the Q&A box to chime in with questions at any point, and we will try to incorporate them as we go. So with that, we'll hop into the first theme of policy mandates versus compliance. And Richard, I'll start with you. The recent executive orders and mandates about AI in the federal government focus heavily on trust and security, yet at the same time mandate things like implementing AI, sharing data, and sharing models. In your mind, what's the single most challenging trade-off your previous agencies will have to make in order to comply with these mandates? Is it speed versus security, transparency versus mission secrecy, or something else entirely?
Thank you, Ronan. Yeah, and it's great to be part of this panel and such an important topic. So I'm glad you're having this panel right at this time. Yeah, some of these mandates, and I want to particularly focus a bit and give a little more context around OMB memo M25-21, which came out in April, which really lays out for civil agencies. I was going to say there are separate responsibilities in the national security world that Mike might touch on, but in the civil world of federal, really lays out 3 areas that they want to see agencies take from an AI perspective. And interestingly, it is, I think, a pretty aggressive approach because it starts with innovation. I mean, with the idea that we should really be leaning forward with the use of AI capabilities across the federal sector. And that should be our if you will, our mandate, our approach, which I don't disagree with, actually. But we have innovation. And then we have the idea of governance. And actually, I was pretty impressed with this idea, each agency to be naming a chief AI officer, that there's an interagency council, that each agency itself should have its own council to bring in the right people, okay, to be dealing with these. And then the third, and not surprising, a very important area is around trust. And getting the right balance here, the right risk management issues. And so to your point, or to your real question around these trade-offs, within this memo, it talks a lot about this idea of sharing models, around even sharing the data, okay, that's used to train the models themselves. And I think that's going to be, if you will, maybe the one that's the most challenging and the most problematic, because it gets very complex very quickly. I mean, I go back to my days at DHS and all the information sharing agreements that we had to put in place to try to make sure that we were meeting legal requirements for information sharing as well as meeting the guidelines around regulations and the like. And so I think you're going to have a similar set of complexities here. Now, and I'm sure we'll get into looking at what can you do from privacy enhancing kind of capabilities, technologies to address some of this. But I think that's where the biggest issues will arise when you start to really look at how can you reuse these models, how can we share data appropriately. I think that's where you're going to run into a lot of complexity.
Interesting. So in your opinion, it's sharing data and models, but doing it in a safe way, however that might be defined.
Well, yeah. I mean, that kind of goes with saying, and we'll get into a lot more about what that means and how we go about do that. But I think, again, you asked where's the challenge and the trade-offs.
Yep.
And I think this idea of how much can we share, what's appropriate sharing, because I think the general view is, hey, if we could share a lot, both on the data side as well as the model side themselves, we could make a lot of headway quickly across many agencies. But I think you're going to run into that wall that I dealt with when I was at DHS of what's appropriate information sharing.
Interesting. And Mike, given your background in national security, do you see the same types of issues, or do you think that there might be a different trade-off?
No, I mean, I think those points are all very valid. I'll look at it a little bit more narrowly from a national security perspective, given my background between the military and the intelligence communities. I always thought the biggest challenge, and I used to say this to the two workforces I led when I was a 4-star, was I think there is an inherent tension between the greatest value of AI and its greatest impact and the frameworks we're trying to put in place to address very legitimate concerns around governance, trust, and innovation. And what I meant by that was, I said, look, when it's all said and done, what I was looking for as a commander out of AI was get me speed and get me scale. I want to be faster than the adversary. I want to adapt faster than the other guy. And I want to be able to anticipate at speed. And then secondly, I want solutions that I can scale globally. I don't want a lot of silos, and I don't want a lot of one-offs here, that we just cannot work efficiently and effectively if we don't get to scale. And so when I think of speed and scale, I often used to remind the team, now, when you think about trust, when you think about governance, when you think about innovation, you sometimes, at least in large bureaucracies like governments, you often run into a tension between this, well, do it faster, but hey, I want to make sure that I have, and I'm not saying that these are invalid concerns, far from it. I always thought that this was going to be the challenge is, okay, Admiral, if you want us to get you speed, then tell me how I do it in a framework that's constantly reminding me, hey, you got to have a governance structure. Hey, we got to make sure that we've got a trust structure that everybody believes in and supports. And don't forget, we got to make sure that we've got a model that is supportive of innovation. It's not that you can't do it. I just thought there was always a tension there between the desired outcome and some of the values that we were saying we needed to make sure we had in place. And I'm not trying to criticize those values. They're all very legitimate. I don't mean to imply they're not.
That's interesting. I mean, not to be trite, but just given we were just talking about it, the reason that, F1 cars can go so quickly is because they do have those right security mechanisms, right? But what's the minimum that you really need in order to go quickly is kind of what you're saying, right? To not overdo it, but to be able to accelerate.
And remember that if you take F1 as an example, your goal is to achieve competitive advantage over everybody else on the grid. And you're trying to do that through a combination of speed, safety, stability, and performance across a broader spectrum. And at the same time, you're being told, okay, we got a specific set of constraints in design. We got a specific set of constraints in performance. So there's always that tension. F1 is not the best analogy because there was a framework that is put in place that says, as important as speed and performance is, for example, hey, you can't use this as justification to override this framework that we've put in place to create security, to create safety. We're not going to do it in the name of winning. The idea in F1, though, is, well, it's a common, if you will, set of conditions in which all participants have to apply to. So it makes perfect sense. the scenario we're talking about here is a very uneven potential implication of AI, where your adversary potentially doesn't have those constraints or places importance in other areas that you don't, etc.
Interesting. We'll get into AI threats and AI defense and this concept of asymmetry. But first, Kurt, I think both Richard and Mike really brought up a core challenge of data sharing versus data security, right? Or AI versus governance. How do privacy technologies fundamentally change the cost-benefit analysis for this? And could you maybe provide an example or two?
Great. No, that's a great question. And Richard and Mike, thank you very much for the comments. One of, kind of something I've wrestled with in my career over and over, especially being on the science and technology side and the tech innovation side, is how can we get these innovations off into the hands of the warfighter in terms of operational use and kind of, provide that speed and scale that I think was referred to earlier. And often I think about these issues of how can we basically drive efficiency by these technologies. And I see these privacy technologies as a great way of sharing data securely, but they're also a great way of making government more efficient overall. And I often think about what's the kind of the pull through, the core driver to get these things deployed at scale. I often think as it has to start somewhere. And there has to be that first user that basically will sign their name on the line to basically say, okay, this is good. I'm going to put my name on it. I'm going to, stake some part of my career to use this technology. And it's often, really kind of small, dare I say, even boring use cases. You have an existing concept of operations. You have an existing kind of workflow. How do I make that workflow more efficient? And I do see kind of the initial driver of AI is, yeah, we can do amazing things, got great insights and everything else. When the rubber meets the road with using this technology on live data, particularly using privacy technologies, security technologies, it's about taking a use case and just making it more efficient in terms of cost. And something that we've seen kind of in the market is that a lot of the cost drivers of adopting security technologies and privacy technologies and data collaboration is human-in-the-loop administrative overhead. The cost of data use agreements, the cost of IRB activities, the cost of MOUs. And I actually love the comment, I think, Mike, you said before about the concept of how can I reduce one-offs. The trouble with these IRBs and administrative overhead, everything's a one-off, kind of where it comes. And so, what I want to do is try to drive research efficiency and drive data collaboration efficiency, get trust in the technology because it works in use cases that folks have already signed off on, and then enable kind of the speed and the scale and kind of go large of what can we do now that we kind of accept these technologies and the policymakers and regulators and standard bodies have all signed off on it and we can go forward securely and safely also.
Hey, Kurt, can I make one comment? Because you bring up an interesting thought to me. And I wonder if the use case that we're talking about drives a different solution. So, for example, from a military and an intelligence perspective, efficiency wasn't my number one criteria. What I used to remind the team is effectiveness. I want us to be smarter, faster, and better than the other guy. And if I have to accept some level of less than optimal efficiency to do it, if it generates, mission advantage, in many cases, I would say, okay, I'm willing to pay that price. I couldn't do it universally. So I'm just curious if, different use cases drive us potentially to a different set of criteria. I don't know. It's just a thought.
I think it could. I think you make a very good point that a lot of the drivers, DoD writ large in the science and technology community and the very important mission, that they have over there is exactly that, driving advantage. My experience kind of being, down on kind of the very low level, kind of moving individual technologies over into operational use is one of the challenges with these kind of federated learning capabilities and distributed AI or data collaboration is exactly, as it is. It's a collaboration technology, which means you have multiple parties signing off to basically go and agree to it. The military is a special use case as compared to kind of broader civil government like homeland, because hey, you have a 4-star admiral that can go say like, okay, do it, to a point, right? But I do see this notion of collaboration, particularly collaboration, whether it's with friends or allies or partners who need to be brought in and convinced also. And so, like I said, I think this notion of kind of making it easier to accept these technologies reduces administrative friction. And you're completely right, Mike, about this point. I'm kind of biased a little bit more about also being burned in kind of like ATO processes and things like that, where someone has to kind of sign off who might not be at that, like a 4-star level, to kind of say, okay, I'll put my name on it. I'm going to stake part of my career on the kind of the acceptance of this technology also.
Kurt, Homeland's a great example where the collaboration becomes very, very important. You look at the law enforcement community and literally thousands of different organizations out there at the local level, state level, county level, trying to collaborate appropriately. And I'm actually kind of excited because I think some of the privacy enhancing technologies that we'll get into can really, really leapfrog this whole environment, because the collaboration and sharing and all the restrictions that have been in place make it very, very difficult, right, at times. And it is not like the military, as you were kind of alluding to. It's almost the opposite problem, where we've got a lot of herding of cats kind of problem that we're having to try to do. And so I think, this idea that if we can bring AI capabilities that are meaningful, that can scale, right, as we talked about, but scale kind of both ways. I mean, scale in the sense that it can serve thousands of organizations, but it can also help, the smallest town in America, right, and their law enforcement organization. Then I think you're onto something that can be very, very meaningful as outcomes from a law enforcement perspective.
Yeah, but I think collaboration is going to be so foundational to the future, regardless of what your particular area is. The way I used to phrase it to the teams I led was, the future is all about creating the smartest set of teams. And to do that, guys, we have got to be able to collaborate with a much broader spectrum of people, expertise, organizations, some in the government, some outside the government, some in the U.S., some outside the U.S., different classification levels. But in this collaboration, we have got to instill trust and confidence. Because
actually,
that's key.
On that note, Mike, I think we'll come back to that later. But Richard, something that you just said, around scaling, but what resources might you have, and how to weigh those. How do you see that decentralized components can move beyond simple automation or simple AI to really leveraging AI for mission support, particularly where they might not have the same resources as larger agencies? Like, how do you see that working?
Well, and that's been the bugaboo for, I think, both smaller civilian agencies, and then of course at the state and local level, when you're talking about homeland security, that's been the key issue, or one of the key issues in technology for decades. And as I say, maybe I'm repeating myself here a little bit, but this idea that we've got new technologies coming to the fore, and privacy and enhancing technologies as an example, that enable us to better share information, but still be able to protect it or to meet the regulations, meet the legal requirements. And we're talking about very, very sensitive data here, maybe not classified necessarily, but from a law enforcement sensitive perspective, right? Quite sensitive. And so that kind of capability as foundational, if you will, and then to be able to have models that run on top of that. And I would like to see more and more, you see some of this, but DHS take more of a leadership role in building some of these models, right? That could be used across the whole law enforcement community at scale, so that, as I say, these small law enforcement organizations that don't even have IT staffs or have very few capable people from an IT perspective can actually leverage these models. And the last thing I'll say is, we're also moving more and more into a low code, no code kind of environment, right? Where it isn't your IT professional necessarily that has to be able to tailor these models to be able to deliver value. It can be individuals that have more of a domain expertise from a mission perspective to be able to use these kind of tools. I think as we move more and more into that realm, you'll see more and more leverage of these kind of capabilities as well.
Yeah, because if I could, Richard, I think that's an important point. One of the things you hope out of AI is this spreads advantage among a greater set of individuals.
Mm-hmm.
That you're not tied to specific skill sets associated with specific individuals, which sometimes from a capacity perspective become limiting factors for
Absolutely.
you, particularly when trying to get to scale. And I do think that's one of the best things potentially AI can help us with.
But, Mike, at the same time, in the context of, national security, for instance, AI is also shifting the threat landscape. So, just we're spending time talking about the value of it, but at the same time, there's new threats and new defense mechanisms. Are you more concerned with adversarial AI attacks, like those that target your models, or the malicious use of widely available AI, like we were talking about the democratization of AI?
Yes. To your point, I mean, in my previous life, one of the things I used to say to the teams was, I want us not only to consider AI for how we might use it to generate advantage, but I want us to think about two other prisms. One, how can we use AI to negate the advantage of the adversary?
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, how can we use AI to anticipate how the adversary will be using this? I want to use this as a tool so we can gain deeper understanding and deeper anticipation of adversary behavior, because we know they're going to be using it, guys. And we know their constraints are potentially going to be different than ours. And their risk calculation with AI potentially is going to be very different. That means their approach, their applications, how they're going to use this, how they're going to prioritize. We shouldn't mirror image here. We need to also think about how are they going to use it against us, and how do we make sure we mitigate their ability to do that?
So given that, what's your perspective on which mission areas would have the most to gain by taking that viewpoint?
So number one, the things I looked for as a military guy with AI were, can I get speed advantage in decision making? Can I get enhanced situational awareness that gives me greater knowledge, insight, and awareness of what's going on in the environment and what the adversary is attempting to do? And then lastly, how can AI help me model and understand a broader range of options for me to consider? Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at a broader set of potential courses of action as we would use. I was always a little concerned that experience tends to lead us to using the same techniques over and over again because they worked in a particular situation. And I'm going, if we're dealing with a learning adversary, guys, we got to assume that they're as good as we are, doing the same thing over and over again against a good adaptive adversary and thinking you're going to have the same measure of success. I'm like, guys, this is a recipe for disaster for us. I want us to think about a range of options that the adversary isn't anticipating. I want to put them on the back foot. I want to use this as a tool for us to gain advantage, to put them in the questioning and doubt role.
Interesting. Richard, how does that resonate with you, given your background at DHS and IRS? Is it very different from your viewpoint in terms of the enabling, the mission areas that can be most enabled?
I'm going to take a little bit of a different tact on this because I want to go back to cybersecurity first in general, right, and where we're at. And we've come a long way, right? But the adversaries, kind of to Mike's point, are continuing to evolve rapidly, and so we're in this constant battle. I think the good news is that from a federal perspective, I think we've matured a lot of the processes that we use for making the right kind of risk management determinations as to where we put our resources to best protect the important assets that we have, whether it be in the civilian or military side. And so I think we've made some real progress there. And I'm kind of heartened in that, AI is kind of different, but it's kind of the next step, right? So, AI is information technology, right? So you've got the general cybersecurity capabilities you need. And then there are obviously things that need to be done in addition, because you're dealing with data sets that might have issues with them and the like. We'll talk more about that, I think, in later on. But this idea that we've got now a risk management set of capabilities. So I go back to your initial question of, where am I worried about the threats? I'm really worried about both threats to, an adversary using general AI against us. And I'm also worried about them somehow infiltrating our systems, okay, and doing things that could then harm our systems or the use of our own AI. I think you got to look at both of those as very significant threats. And in fact, I would say that given how, and I'm not saying this is wrong, because I think we should be trying to push the innovation. I think we should be trying to really deploy these capabilities out there because they can be so game changing. But that also means that we have got to make sure that we're looking across that whole landscape, all right, and that we are putting the right kinds of risk management protocols in place that are then backed up with actual, right, cybersecurity protections or whatever needs to be put in place in order to best protect these systems and ourselves, by the way. So
that's a really good point. I mean, Kurt, given your background and with privacy technologies, how does that fit into sort of Richard's view of the world, right? Where we need to have, risk management and cybersecurity, but still we need enablement, right, of the mission. So how do technologies today help address these, security, risk, privacy, availability, explainability, transparency concerns?
Right. No, that's a great question. And let me come at it, slightly to kind of roll back the conversation ever so slightly and then kind of get back to what you were saying before. The benefit of AI, I very, very strongly believe is kind of like twofold. One is automating human loop type processes where there might not be enough law enforcement officers, might not be enough, intelligence analysts, might not be enough, cancer researchers, and kind of automating those processes. The other benefit that I see from these technologies is providing changes in biases overall. You think about, for example, analysts, for example, coming out of the Cold War, be very kind of trained on kind of, Soviet, thinking, kind of Soviet approaches to things. And then boom, 9/11, and it's a very different, model that one would have to apply, a different set of biases one would have to develop overall. And I'm not saying biases in any kind of good or bad thing. It's just, kind of trained of thought overall. You start to get these AI models, you start to get these trainings that kind of develop over time, whether it's human loop or automated or kind of, mixed or, chimera type solutions, where, you're able to kind of change the biases on thought processes, automated thought processes very, very quickly, which is, I think is absolutely wonderful from a kind of a security perspective. And that having a diversity of opinion to be able to kind of go and identify, potentially risks as they emerge much more quickly, with different viewpoints as they go. And I think what happens with that also is that as one kind of builds these stables of technologies, both rapidly delivering and kind of keeping things on a shelf for when it break glass when needed type scenarios, or constant monitoring type scenarios, is that you can start to get traceability of where the biases came from overall. And one of the challenges with kind of regular humans like us is that we kind of have these long lives that we've had and kind of very enjoyable lives that we've had, and we have our biases that might not be apparent to others. When you start using these more automated technologies, you can start getting provenance information about how these were trained, where they kind of came from, how they've kind of altered over time as it is, which like I said, I think is a kind of a wonderful thing, especially as you start to know what's the right tool for the right job at the right time also.
Actually, I mean, we have an audience question, which I think is pertinent to this as well. And that's that the output of the systems as a result of what you're talking about can seem compelling and give you that illusion that everything is right and you have good insights, but everything might be corrupted behind the scenes, maybe by an adversary, and that might change that traceability of biases that you're talking about. So, given that, Kurt, we'll start with you. What advice do you have to sort of avoid this trap?
No, that's a very big, very important question as one seeks to operationalize these kinds of technologies. I'll come back to what I said before, which was, maintaining some understanding of provenance, some understanding of how these models have been trained or retrained over time. One of the nice things I think that comes out from collaborative model building, taking data from multiple sources, is that it becomes harder for any one bad actor to really influence and kind of have some of these bad actions lost in the noise. And I think that there's a bit of a kind of a proactive preventative nature that kind of arises as you start to kind of have the diversity of data and collaborative data that kind of comes together to train or retrain these models also.
Interesting. Richard, do you have a
Yeah, I
view
might
on
jump
this?
in. There's NIST has been pushing this concept of an AI development lifecycle, which I'm kind of taken with. 3 phases, kind of simple. Before you actually build a system, as you build the system, and then post deployment, if you will. And one of the big things is that you're constantly testing and evaluating this, right? All through all 3 of these phases. And to this point of perhaps an adversary has gotten in and corrupted your models, and it might look good, but it's no longer good. This idea of test and evaluation doesn't stop. Even in deployment, that the idea that you're constantly assessing whether or not the quote, the output of whatever AI system it is delivering what it should. And so now, what it should, okay, is also got a lot of complexity to it, and the issues of bias and the like. But at least this notion that if you're doing this correctly, this constant evaluation should be on the back end, starting if you've got adversaries that have corrupted your system, you'd be able to catch that relatively early on. At least that's the concept.
And hey, can I throw in a comment, which I think Richard makes an important point? In some ways, look, this concept that Richard's just outlined is not unique to AI generated information. I'm going, look, certainly as an intel guy and a military guy, we're constantly saying we have to continue to reassess. We have to continue to question assumptions. We're going to continue to revalidate and assess, even as we're making decisions, even as we're reaching conclusions, even as we're taking action based on those. So to me, I find it a little interesting at times that I hear people talk and I think to myself, you're making it sound as if this is like a whole new problem set because it's AI. And I'm going, I don't look at it that way at all. We have to account for it, but it's not something new. So I think there's a lot we can learn from what we're doing already.
So would your advice, I mean, to federal and technology leaders looking at AI or data or data analytics around privacy and security change at all in the world of AI? Or, is your advice,
the thing that is specific to AI, I always thought was number one, know your models, know your data sets, and understand the algorithms that you've created so that you understand the biases that are potentially inherent. And it also goes to the importance of collaboration as a vehicle to address this. The broader set of data, the greater the amount of data, the greater the amount of potential other parties. Those are all methods in my mind to mitigate some of the potential impact here where I'm going. So I would argue that AI, in fact, is going to drive us in some ways to collaborate even closer, particularly around data privacy and security topics.
Interesting. The image that you evoked for me is, diversifying a stock portfolio. So you're saying diversify your data and partner portfolio in a sense.
Yeah.
Richard, I think you were going to
jump
in
in. I was going to pick up, Mike brings up a good theme. There's this isn't like all brand new, right? And so one example, and I'm pretty well taken with, I've always been a big believer in what NIST did from the cybersecurity framework, which is really risk management around cybersecurity, right? Which has essentially been adopted across the U.S. federal government and many, many private sector organizations around the world, actually. And so looking at what now NIST has done in extending that into their AI risk management framework, if you study that framework, it looks an awful lot like the cybersecurity framework, right?
I've seen this before.
But it's got extensions, and these extensions are all about what's specific to AI. And a lot of that has to do with the data itself. I mean, not all, but most of it, a lot of it has to do with the data itself. So how do you deal with the data issues that you run into that can cause downstream effects for the output of AI systems? And so I think, to Mike's point, this isn't new under the sun kind of stuff. This is like, hey, we've been doing this, we've been maturing this. NIST has given us a roadmap, and I think it's an important roadmap, and it's very well done. And so I give them a lot of credit. And I think from an, if I was sitting back in the CIO chair, I'd be pushing pretty hard for us to be using that framework appropriately. Now, right at the beginning of this, Mike talked about this tension you have, and I guess I'm a big believer that if you can get governance right, it doesn't necessarily have to slow things down. In fact, if it's done right and you collaborate well, in some ways you might be able to speed things up because you're collaborating appropriately. However, the bureaucracy in many government agencies, not just federal, does tend to take hold, and so I think striking this right kind of balance of using the right type of governance, but really pushing the innovation, really, getting I'm a big believer in pilots. It's now part of, best process for IT systems and for AI systems. Get those prototypes out there, get those pilots out there, go through and use that life cycle I was just talking about to refine, make sure the models are working well before you deploy them at any kind of scale. But let's be aggressive about it. I am a big believer. We should be. The technology's there, the capabilities are there. Boy, let's be aggressive about using them, because we know our competitors, our adversaries are doing that right now.
Great. I completely, that resonates with me. I wish you were the CIO for everyone that we work with.
Get that resume out there, Richard. Come on.
Yeah.
There's a future for you, Beckett.
I want to move on to another important stakeholder in this, which is the public. So, building public trust is vital for AI adoption for any government. And even, by the way, in the private sector, building trust with your customers is vital for being able to adopt AI. And so I'm curious, Mike and Richard, in your opinions, what's the most effective mechanism for ensuring that these public-facing AI systems are fair and unbiased before they're deployed, so that you get it right before you hit go? And is that even possible?
I guess so. The first comment I would make is you got to start by acknowledging that there is a requirement to generate trust here. You just can't assume it's going to happen with the view that, well, look, I've generated this amazing technology. It's given me this tremendous insight, and any idiot could see how good this is. And they shouldn't be uncomfortable with it. I mean, you run into, I have certainly run into that attitude at times in the military about, hey, it's so self-evident about how valuable this is. We don't need to spend any time really articulating that value or defending that value. And I'm going, that's not the way the rest of the world works, you guys. I also think trust is an important component of collaboration. Again, if we're trying to argue that we want to increase collaboration as a tool to both enhance effectiveness and enhance outcome and also help to mitigate risk, then collaboration, in my experience, is directly tied to trust among the parties. Not just as individuals and organizations, but trust in the data, trust in their data sources, trust in their knowledge and expertise. I would always look for partners that I thought actually understood what the hell we were trying to do and weren't trying to blow smoke, where it was all about making money. And I'm going, guys, I got it. You got to make money if you're in the private side. I don't have a question with that. I'm a capitalist. I may be a military guy, work in the government, but I'm a capitalist, damn it. And I understand how that's important. On the other hand, if this is only going to be about money, we're not going to get to that trust factor. And I'll be very hesitant to fully trust you if my belief is all you care about is this is a use case for greater revenue.
Interesting. And Richard, what about your view? I mean, IRS is maybe the most public-facing agency
Yeah.
out there, right?
And the most popular. Everybody loves it.
Did I say most out there? I meant most popular. Yeah.
We used to
What's
take
your
pride in being the most hated institution in the United States. So one, I don't think the words come up, but I have to go back to the OMB memo I referenced earlier, the 25-21. One of the first things they talk about is transparency, and I think building trust, collaboration, as Mike says, is very important, but also transparency, right? And this idea that appropriately, right? But we need to explain what we're doing. We need to be able to show, right, what we're doing, and even talk about the data. Maybe not the specific data elements in the sense of actual names or social security numbers or whatever it may be, but the actual structure of what we're using, the data sources and how they've been vetted, and even acknowledge, right? I mean, bias is a big issue here, and it's very, very difficult to get large data sets that don't have some type of bias, and so acknowledging that and discussing it and discussing how we're trying to address that bias over time. These are the things that help build trust. And so I'm pretty big on this idea that particularly, as you say, for public facing kinds of solutions, that we try to be transparent. Now, most the average citizen isn't going to care a lot about the details and the like, but there's always going to be those that really do care about the details. And to the degree that you can share those details, and then that they can then amplify that and say, yes, we believe agency X has gone through the right processes here. They're acknowledging the risks they face. They're trying to address those risks. And they've made a business decision, if you will, or a mission decision to move out and leverage this capability, I think is the right attitude to have from a perspective of being transparent.
Interesting. Thanks, Richard. I just want to take a moment to pause and remind the audience, please ask questions. We'll move on into an open Q&A in just a couple of minutes. So think of your best one and drop it in the chat. And while we're waiting for that, Kurt, I wanted to move to you. Looking ahead over the next 1 year or 2 years, if the federal government successfully adopts AI that includes privacy and security technology in it, what do you think the most transformative, high-value collaboration will be that might currently be impossible, but today, next year might become routine, right? Is it healthcare research like you've brought up? Is it collaborating with our allies more closely? What do you think it might be?
Right. So I think this is actually a great segue from some of the conversation from Richard and Mike earlier. And I'm going to put on, Mike, I got my own capitalist hat kind of for what it is, and I'll kind of play as capitalist for a little bit. Is that, I often think about who are the users of these technologies and what are the market needs, in federal government or just government writ large. And I often think about the so to speak Goldilocks model of privacy technologies and as it is, that if you have organizations at one side that have full and total trust in one another, brother to brother, mother to son kind of relationships, there's no need for privacy technologies, to a point, right? At the other side, if there's kind of the other far extreme, that they're just total adversaries and they can't necessarily operate in together in any way, they're not going to want to collaborate even under the protection of privacy technologies. There's that kind of like that healthy middle ground where, yeah, I like those guys over there, but they can't quite give everything, as it is. And so I see successful adoption in the federal government as being driven by that. I've often thought about, peer organizations kind of partnering with one another, whether it's about, for example, Homeland Security partnering with Justice or Treasury or Defense. It's kind of like very, very, very close mission alignment. But, whether it's regulatory concerns or other kinds of, things that might be going on, might kind of, create friction where there is a large mission need for privacy technologies. I often think about kind of like the kind of, the very patriotic and kind of great attitude that I think we all have about federalism about how the states kind of have their domain,
Mhm.
and how the federal government has their responsibilities, and they're often very, very aligned, but slightly different also. And having that as being a way where the states have plenty of data, and Richard, you alluded to this before, particularly in the homeland security kind of law enforcement context. There's lots of data at the state level that could help one another,
Mhm.
multiple states at the same time, or the federal government mission, and any aspect of just kind of good governance, also, not just homeland and law enforcement too. And so I think that kind of Goldilocks kinds of collaboration, where there's very strong mission alignment, but kind of some degree of friction around regulation, or kind of not total trust, I think is probably going to be the way that's going to drive this in terms of adoption of privacy technologies for AI overall.
Yeah, and hey, if I could, Kurt, I think that the point you make also, that one of the biggest areas of friction in some ways is between private sector and government. Hey, how can you use technology to enhance collaboration between groups that both have significant insight? And yes, there's a level of mistrust, distrusts, cultural bias about each other that impede effectiveness, that impede mission accomplishment and efficiency. I hope that AI and some of the collaboration that I hope it is going to fuel is going to help us overcome that. Or at least
So actually, I'll use that to sort of jump into a question while we have more rolling in. Is Mike, if you had to issue one new policy mandate today to ensure the adoption of AI in a responsible way, what would it be?
So first, broadly, what I would want to do. The biggest challenge with AI to me is not the technology. The biggest challenge is the cultural dimensions of large bureaucratic organizations, their comfort level with a new set of technologies, which in their mind, they often associate with as risk, as a risk source. And so the first thing I'd want to do is, how can I help to overcome some of that bureaucratic resistance and to foster a greater willingness to accept risk when it comes to AI? Now, as Richard has said, for example, look, there's lots of ways to mitigate that risk. Governance can be an important mitigation tool. Transparency and openness can be important mitigation tools, but it all starts with a belief to me that decision makers and executors say, this is worth doing. I'm going to do it. We're going to do it. Not, boy, this really scares the hell out of me, and I see nothing but problems in all this. And until I'm told by somebody that what I can do and what I should do, hey, I'm not really going to drive this. And I'm going, guys, we again go back to speed and scale. If that's the attitude, we can't get to speed, we can't get to scale, we can't get to advantage.
Mike, that's so well said. Oh my God, that is spot on for what ails most government agencies, right? Is we need leadership that's willing to step out there, and and it can't be unbridled risk, right? It's got to be measured risk, but you've got to take risk as leaders, and we need more of that in government in general.
Couldn't agree with the two of you more. We have a few questions that have come in that I'll try to combine. We've been talking about the concept of trust across organizations, and maybe it's one thing for two government agencies to trust one another, but it's entirely another thing for a government agency to trust a vendor, right? So the questions are, what blessing would an AI or privacy technology provider need in order to gain trust from a government agency, and also, how does that also factor into the public view of all of this, right? The discussion around, we've talked about federal, state, local, private organizations. What level of trust does the public need to gain in order for them to be comfortable with the government taking on these types of technologies?
I'll start with a couple of points. Having served in government a couple of times myself, I don't think the answer to the first part of that question about how vendors can become trusted within government agencies is any different, whether it's AI technology or offering any other kinds of services. I want to believe, not that it happens. I mean, trust doesn't, you don't build trust in a day kind of thing, right? I mean, but over time, building a relationship, and a relationship in which I feel like, as when I was a government official, that I feel like the vendor that I'm working with has got my interest aligned with theirs. Okay. And so this notion that, and I understand they're, I've been on the other side too. I mean, they're to make profit. They're to drive revenue and more revenue and all that. And I get all that. But ultimately, if you're going to serve the government, you need to look out for the government's interests. And I think it starts with that foundational concept. And then with AI in particular, I'm going to just reiterate this issue of transparency, right? That the degree that the vendor can help both themselves be transparent regarding their technologies and what they offer, and educating appropriately the government officials that they're working with, that's very, very key. And also helping the government be more transparent, right? Now you're getting into the realm of the public trust issues that go with AI, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. So I think it comes back to, I've got to build trust as a vendor with my government partners over time, and I've got to show that we have aligned interest, and that I understand their interest, and I'm going to use that as my guiding light as a vendor.
And
interesting, thank you. Mike, what do you think?
So for me, I generally looked at, I very much agree with Richard's point about, again, this isn't unique to AI, guys. This is a challenge in every commercial relation. For me, I used to tell the team, generally, I look for 3 criteria. Number 1, show me you have capability. I'm not interested in a snake oil salesman that can't deliver. You got to show me you got actual capability that will generate the outcome that we need. Secondly, I want to make sure you understand my needs and constraints, because that way you can generate solutions that are have a much higher probability of being effective. And because again, I'm interested in effectiveness and efficiency. And then thirdly, show me you want to be a partner and not just a vendor. I don't want a strictly purely commercial, I give you this, you give me that. That's not, I said, we can do it that way, and we got contracts that help us, but I really want a partnership. I want your knowledge. I want your insight. And I want to share with you our knowledge and our insight. And I want to see what we can do together to generate the solution sets we need. And I think in AI, this idea of how we're going to generate mutually beneficial solutions, I think becomes really, really important. Because if you're a vendor, you're trying to argue, okay, I want to come up with solutions that I can scale, that I can potentially look at multiple customer sets, that I don't want to make so unique, so stovepipe that they only really pertain to one entity. I'm trying to see what I can do to, to work more broadly in this area, to come up with broader solution sets.
Interesting. Yes, it definitely resonates for me from the vendor side as well, those comments from both of you. So thank you. Another question, and this I admit could probably be a webinar all by itself, is you can't decouple AI from its infrastructure, right? Operationalizing AI is going to require the availability of infrastructure like chips, and there's a lot in the news today about these topics with NVIDIA and Intel and China and more. How does this fit into the ability of organizations to use AI today? And I know this is a very deep, let's say geopolitical question. But maybe Kurt, I'll start with you, given your sort of intersection with AI and privacy technologies, and then if we have time, I'll give it over to Richard and Mike.
Sure, you're talking about the kind of the intersection of chips with kind of AI in general, or kind of government policy positions more broadly.
And how do you ensure privacy and security in sort of the supply chain and availability, right?
Right. No, that's an interesting question. I know this is something that's been very big, for government overall, is supply chain security and supply chain issues, more broadly, whether it's software, hardware, data or whatnot. The traditional solutions for that have always been provenance, like cradle to grave, like where did it come from, kind of where did it go, kind of the steps in this life cycle. Have there been only trusted individuals, handling it, manipulating it, or kind of going through otherwise. you know, as kind of these technologies have gone forward, privacy technologies, allow a kind of a bit of a hands off of, I don't necessarily need to touch the data. I don't necessarily need to totally understand some aspects, and I want to be very, very careful about how I say this, some aspects of provenance of some aspects of hardware and software, because you have these privacy technologies that basically provide a degree of defense and depth also with, information supply chains, if I could frame it that way. And, I see this as kind of like, in some sense, a bit of a brave new world about where we're going of, one is, onshoring is a thing, and that's a perfectly viable solution to supply chain issues. But there has been a big push in government, which I believe we've all seen, about greater use of commercial solutions where commercial solutions have not previously been used before, which is, drives economic efficiency, was a perfectly fine motivation for these. And then how do you start doing it securely? And that's where I think some of these defense and depth issues start to come, particularly for using privacy technologies where you can basically provide things like confidentiality of data, confidentiality of insights, even if some aspects of the substrate underneath, hardware, software, or otherwise, is not necessarily, fully vetted in some ways because it is coming from a commercial vendor also. And I see that as a bit of a brave new world, especially as you start to kind of stick modules together and start to, be able to compose systems much more rapidly, with commercial solutions where the kind of you're opening up, the arsenal, so to speak, of what you might actually use as you kind of go forward with mission operations.
Thanks, Kurt. I think we have time for one more question, and there's been a question that's been sitting since almost the start, which is in the context of AUKUS. So Mike, looking to the future, what single lesson can we learn from the USA on IA readiness for AUKUS?
So when we say, I want to make sure, first of all, when we say IA readiness, we're talking about interagency, or we?
Interpret it as you will. All we have is the...
So my first thought would be, number one, make sure that we fully understand the AUKUS ecosystem. There's a lot of complexity in building, designing, creating, maintaining, manning, operating nuclear submarines. That is a pretty complex ecosystem, and there's a lot of parts to it. And at times, I'm a little concerned that we haven't really dug as deeply into the eco. We tended to focus on the most visible. Hey, shipyards is an example. It's an important component of the AUKUS framework and our ability to actually generate much of it, but it's not the only piece. So understanding the ecosystem, and then secondly, where can you accept risk and where can you potentially mitigate risk? Because one of the challenges with AUKUS to me is going to be about speed and cost, speed and cost, speed and cost. If we're not careful, we're going to come up with a solution that we're going to price ourselves out of, and it's going to take so long that we're not going to be able to retain the political will to go after a program that's going to take a decade plus.
Thank you. With that, Richard, Mike, Kurt, thank you very much for your time and your insights today. To the audience, thank you for the engagement and the great questions. I certainly learned a lot. I'll try to summarize these and send them out to everyone who might be interested. But really, truly, it's an honor having you here and to learn from you and to hear your insights from all three of you. So thank you very much. And to the audience, thanks for joining. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.